Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 7. We're going to cover Part 2, where we talk about bone formation. We have two words here to describe bone formation. We have ossification and osteogenesis. We can see the word os and osteo, so that should tell us something about bone, right? This begins in the embryo, continues through childhood and adolescence. About the 8th to 12th week of development is when we start to see the skeleton form. And there are two types of ossification. There's intramembranous, intra between membranes, and endo inside chondrial cartilage. So we'll see intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. So first we have intramembranous ossification. This is bone growth within a membrane, inside a membrane. Our flat bones of the skull, some of our facial bones, our mandible, and the middle part of the clavicle is going to develop through this intramembranous ossification. If you remember, we have that structure of compact bone, and then we have spongy bone, right? And then we have another layer of compact bone. Remember that diplo structure that we talked about? So intramembranous ossification develops flat bones of the skull, facial bones, mandible, and part of the clavicle. Here's a nice representation of intramembranous ossification. Here they're pointing out a mesenchymal cell, a collagen fiber, and they're showing you a lot of background or ground substance. So this has to be connective tissue, right? It has cells, it has fibers, it has a lot of space. So this is a connective tissue specific to embryos. So this mesenchymal connective tissue is where the beginning of intramembranous ossification occurs. Here we have an ossification center. So we see that some osteoblasts are kind of gathering in the center here of this mesenchymal tissue. Remember, osteoblasts had to be created from osteoprogenitor cells or osteogenic cells. And we know that osteoblasts start secreting osteoids, and then eventually the osteoids become hardened or crystallized, right? Calcified. So eventually we have osteoblasts on the outside, we have calcified crystals on the inside, and we trap some of the osteoblasts, and so now they become an osteocyte. So this should all kind of be a repeat of what we talked about in part 1. What happens eventually is you kind of have this unorganized structure. So you can't really see the top layer, right, the compact bone layer. You kind of just see this kind of mess, we'll say. So what's going to happen is blood vessels are going to start entering, and you're going to see more of an organization. You're going to see the periosteum start developing. You're going to see more bone being calcified. And so eventually you're going to have these lamellar layers, right? Lamellar. And then you're going to have your spongy bone interwoven. You're going to have your trabeculae, you're going to see your blood vessels, and then you're going to create that periosteum lining, which has the cells as well, right? It has osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So if you can just give me a couple sentences about this process, I think you'll be good to go. The second type of ossification is called endochondral, and so it's going to happen inside cartilage. So it's going to begin with hyaline cartilage, and it produces most of the bones of the skeleton. So upper and lower limbs, so that's arm, leg, so that's humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula, the pelvis, all of your vertebrae, and the ends of the clavicle. So basically people think of this usually as long bone development. I'm not going to go through the individual steps. I'm going to go to the image and we'll look at it from there. Endochondral ossification starts at about 8 to 12 weeks, and we start with fetal hyaline cartilage, and we're going to see chondrocytes. And what happens are the chondrocytes start secreting matrix, and that matrix becomes calcified, and we create this perichondrium structure. From the perichondrium, we're going to see the stem cells start creating osteoblasts. So we're going to have osteoprogenitor cells creating osteoblasts. And now we're going to start calcifying bony matrix, right? Or matrix from the osteoblasts. So the perichondrium turns into a bony collar. At the same time that this is happening, we have cartilage the cells are becoming really large. They're kind of displacing the cells that are already there as they grow really large. But then they don't have a blood supply, so they all start dying. So they leave like these pockets in the diaphysis. And that's how we get that hollowed out cavity, is because the cartilage enlarged and then died, and they left the space that was there. So then we see this primary ossification center start developing. So these osteoblasts that produce the bony collar are going to start secreting matrix, and we're going to have bone laid down, but it still has lots of holes there because of the cartilage. Another event that occurs in the fetal period are the blood vessels make their way through the bony collar and start weaving their way through the diaphysis. Remember, there were holes there from the cartilage that died, so they have an area to weave through. And the bone is going to grow in both areas away from the primary ossification center. When we get to the newborn child events, you can see that we pretty much have the start of the medullary cavity. That would be osteoclasts responsible for that action, right? We see bone growing, and we're going to see secondary ossification centers, and these are going to work just like the primary. You're going to have cartilage, it's going to calcify, those cells are going to die, and then we're going to see osteoblasts come in, secrete matrix, have that matrix hardened. But you're still going to have these areas of active cartilage. So these areas are still active so that we can grow, because this is not as big as our humerus is going to be in our adulthood. Now we can see something that looks more like a humerus that we're familiar with. So as a child, you're still going to have these sections of cartilage, and this is your epiphyseal plate. Some people call it a growth plate, because we're still not at full adult size yet. So you can see, it might be a little bit hard, but you can see these lines that kind of exist at the top and the bottom. If you found a bone from a child, you could tell whether it was an adult or not, because you'd see this gap. And this gap tells you that there's still an epiphyseal plate. In an adult, we now have an epiphyseal line. So if I saw this humerus, I could see that there wasn't a gap at the top and the bottom like there is in an adolescent bone. Let's talk a little bit more about the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate. So we have several different zones here. Basically the same thing's going to happen. You're going to have a chondrocyte, and that chondrocyte's going to secrete a matrix, and that matrix is going to harden, and that happens here. And then eventually what's going to happen are osteoblasts are going to come in and lay down bone on top of the calcified cartilage. The reason that I bring this up is we used to have an issue if a child fell and broke their bone right in the middle of an epiphyseal plate. So imagine if all of a sudden I have a broken epiphyseal growth plate, I've disrupted this tissue, and let's say instead of regeneration I did fibrosis, right? Fibrosis is scar tissue. Is there any way for these cartilage cells, these chondrocytes, is there any way for them to jump over the scar tissue and get to this calcified cartilage, which then allows for the osteoblast to lay down matrix? No, that'd be really hard, right? So that scar tissue in the middle of a growth plate is not good. It can hinder growth of that particular long bone. Here's a nice colorized x-ray of a child's hand, and I just want to kind of point out where some of these gaps are located. So I can look at this x-ray and I can tell that this is a child's hand because I'm seeing kind of these little gaps between the epiphyseal ends and the diaphysis. And so that lets me know if this was an adult bone, I would not see that little line. It would all be one bone. It would seem smooth, right? This is how we can make generalizations if we find a bone. So there's either an opening, so there's no union between the epiphyseal ends and the diaphysis. There might be partial, so the epiphyseal plate was starting to turn into an epiphyseal line, or there's a complete union where all you can see is the entire bone. There is no indentation there, right? Also, something to consider is that female epiphyseal plates fuse about 1 to 2 years earlier than males because of the strong effect that estrogen plays on the cartilage in the epiphyseal growth plate. The previous slides we were talking about interstitial growth, or growth in length. This image is showing you appositional growth or width. You can see here the periosteum. Remember, we also have endosteum, and both of those have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So while the osteoclasts are reabsorbing bone, osteoblasts are building up bone, and eventually you're going to see a widening of the medullary cavity and the diaphysis, and you're going to see a much thicker layer of compact bone in an adult. I want to mention achondroplasia. A in front of something means not. Chondro means cartilage. Plasia means formation. So no cartilage formation. Failure of chondrocytes in the epiphyseal growth plate to grow and enlarge. Basically, you have limited endochondral ossification. And if you remember, that affects long bones mostly. Other bones continue to grow as normal. In these individuals, they'll have a really, it looks like a disproportionately large head, but it's really just the head that they would have had if their bones had grown. It just looks really large because their long bones of their limbs are so much smaller. We will talk about another type of dwarfism. So this is genetic. There's another one that's called pituitary dwarfism, and this is due to hormones. So this is deficient growth hormone that causes the long bones not to develop. Sometimes you'll hear people say that bone is metabolically active throughout your life. What they mean by metabolic, right? Build up and break down. So bone remodeling is continuing through adulthood for the rest of your life. So you are constantly building up bone and breaking down bone depending on your activity. It occurs at different rates, but about 20% of the skeleton is replaced yearly. So it's dependent upon the osteoblasts, which build, the osteocytes, which are the mature bone cells, and the osteoclasts, which break down bones. And they're influenced by hormones and mechanical stress. So let's talk about those two a little bit. Mechanical stress that you put on your bones is actually required for normal bone remodeling. So think about gravity. We are on the earth and we have gravity pushing down on us, and that causes bone remodeling. We're going to build up in certain areas. We're going to break down bone in certain areas. Think about what implications this could have for astronauts, right? That go up into space. We have less gravity in space, or no gravity, right? In some cases. So what do you think happens to bone the longer you're in space? Well, you have decreased bone mass, right? So if we remove the mechanical stress from the environment that we were born in, that's going to cause decreased bone mass. If you do weight-bearing activities or exercises, you can increase your bone mass. If you've ever done yoga and they make you stand on one leg and balance, right? You're putting all of your body weight on that tibia, on whichever leg you're standing on, and that should cause your tibia to say, oh, well, if she's going to keep doing this, I probably need to start building more bone. I don't want you to get too hung up on all of the hormones. I just want you to realize that hormones can affect bone growth. So we have a hormone called growth hormone, It's excreted from the anterior pituitary. We're going to talk about this in the second half of this course when we get to the endocrine chapter. So growth hormone directly stimulates cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. It's basically what tells the cartilage to divide. We have our thyroid hormone. You may have heard people talk about their metabolism, right? I have a fast metabolism, I have a slow metabolism. That is somewhat controlled by the thyroid hormone. So it also regulates the activity of buildup and breakdown at the epiphyseal growth plate. Sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, are secreted in large amounts at puberty. It increases the rate of cartilage growth, and eventually the cartilage is replaced with bone, and the epiphyseal plate closes, and now it's an epiphyseal line. Last hormone I want to talk about are glucocorticoids. So glucocorticoids are released during times of stress. They help regulate blood glucose. So you could imagine if you had increased glucose, if you're under stress, then you could make more ATP. The only problem is lots of glucocorticoids being released can cause bone loss in both adults and children. In children, it specifically inhibits growth at the epiphyseal plate. In adults, it could cause your bones to be weaker. You can still lose bone mass, and if you're over a certain age, if you lose bone mass, you're not going to be able to replace it. After 40, you start losing bone mass, and there's not much we can do about it. Now we need to move on to talk about some hormones that help regulate calcium in the blood. So what does this have to do with bone? Where do we store calcium? We store it in our bones, right? If we need it, we can break bone down and we can release calcium into our bloodstream. And why would we want to do this? What do we need calcium for? For the heart to work, muscle contraction, all of it. The heart, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, for all your neurons to fire, for blood clotting, we have to have enough calcium in our blood for all of these activities. So we have two hormones that we need to talk a little bit about. This image has a lot of stuff going on, but one of the things you should recognize right away: stimulus, receptor, control center, effector. So the stimulus is you have low calcium levels in your blood, and we know from the previous slide why that's not good. The parathyroid gland detects that the calcium is low, and it releases parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone works in conjunction with this calcitriol that's released from the kidneys to cause these effects to happen. So the parathyroid hormone and the calcitriol are going to tell osteoclasts to increase. What do osteoclasts do? They break down bone. And when they break down bone, they release calcium. And where does it get released to? The blood. So we had low blood calcium. Do we now have increased blood calcium, at least from the bone? Yes. What else can parathyroid hormone do? It can go to the kidneys and tell them, do not release any calcium in the urine. Keep every drop of calcium. In this case, the calcitriol is what actually talks to the small intestines, and it says the same thing as the parathyroid does to the kidneys. Reabsorb every drop of calcium that comes your way. Be able to tell me what parathyroid hormone does. What does it tell all of these organs along with the calcitriol helper? But what does parathyroid hormone do? If your blood calcium is low, parathyroid hormone is going to do what? It's going to increase your blood calcium level. How? Explain what's happening in these different organs. Here we just look at rickets for a second. It's this bow-legged appearance. The lower legs kind of bow out a little bit. It's a disturbance in growth due to the fact that you have low blood calcium. And why do you have low blood calcium? Because you have a deficiency in vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D is the precursor for the calcitriol. So if you don't have the calcitriol, you cannot raise your blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone can do it a little bit, but you really need that helper, right? So this is going to cause some issues with long bone development. Calcitonin is another hormone that kind of does the opposite of what parathyroid hormone does. So parathyroid hormone, we had low calcium in our blood and we increased the calcium to a homeostatic level. Calcitonin, we have high calcium and we're going to bring it back down to normal levels. Calcitonin is less significant than parathyroid hormone. Some people say this isn't even active in adults. I still want you to understand what calcitonin is because I think it's a good antagonist. It does the opposite of what parathyroid does. So you can kind of think of the two going hand in hand. So if calcitonin, if it tones down your calcium, if your calcium is too high, if you have too much calcium in your bloodstream, where can I store it? I can take this high calcium and I can store it in my bones. And what's going to happen to my calcium level if I pull out calcium from my blood and I store it in my bones? Well, my blood calcium level is going to go down. So you would think that calcitonin, if you're going to remove the calcium, you're going to increase osteoblast activity, right? If you increase osteoblast, you remove calcium from the blood, and where do you store it? You store it in the bones. We also want to inhibit osteoclast. Stop releasing calcium. My calcium is already too high. Do not release any more into the blood. As we get older, we're going to see insufficient ossification or osteopenia. That's bone loss. So your bones become thinner and weaker as you age. I'm sure we've heard of osteoporosis or spongy bone, right, or porous bone. Basically, these are weak bones that are prone to fracture. You have decreased bone mass. It's linked to age, so you're usually older. Women are more at risk, Caucasian women, if you have a history of smoking. Also, if you're short, if you're small in stature, you have less bone mass to begin with. So as it starts breaking down due to all of these other factors, you're going to have more bone loss than someone else. We do have medical treatments after the fact. So these medical treatments maybe stimulate new bone growth, give you stem cells, or we could slow the rate of bone loss. But the best treatment is prevention, which we don't like to hear, right? So if you're in your 20s or 30s, you should watch your diet. You should have lots of calcium. You should be very physically active. That'll cause you to have more bone mass so that when you start losing bone, you had tons to begin with, so you'll probably be okay. The last couple slides, we're just going to talk about bone fracture and repair. Obviously, fracture is a break in the bone, and they can be classified by the type of fracture. So whether it's stress, physical activity-induced stress, whether there's some sort of disease that's weakening your bones, whether it's a simple fracture, meaning it's not penetrating the skin, or a compound where a piece of the bone is sticking out of the skin. You can go through this list, this classification of bone fractures. Comminuted is interesting. I just like the word, but basically the bone is splintered into several small pieces. You're probably going to have screws or plates to put all that bone mess back together, right? Green stick is interesting. This usually happens in children. Remember, they have more cartilage, so their bones are a little bit more pliable. So it's a partial fracture. It didn't go all the way through. It didn't break all the way through. It just kind of splintered a little bit. It's a partial fracture. The other one that's interesting are spiral fractures. You usually see these in sports. They can be a sign of child abuse as well, from like twisting, grabbing force. So you can look through these. It's kind of interesting. Nice image of a fracture repair here. I would give 1 or 2 sentences about what's going on. We can see that this break has caused a hematoma. Remember, that bone is highly vascularized. So when the bone breaks, it's going to rip these blood vessels, and then the blood is going to fill part of the cavity and push out here on the periosteum. And then we're going to have a soft callus that forms, and this is the cartilage. Remember, we lay down cartilage first, and then we have matrix that gets matrix that hardens. And then we have the osteoblasts coming in, and the osteoblasts do the same thing. They lay down their matrix, and then that gets hardened, and now we have a hard bony callus that's formed. Remember again, the periosteum has the cells. The periosteum has osteoclasts, osteoblasts, stem cells. So that's how these osteoblasts come in and start producing what we think of as hard bone, right? You're also going to see the blood vessels start regenerating and filling back in the area. And then eventually we have to come back and we have to remodel this extra bone that's kind of sticking out. So eventually we're going to remodel the bone and we're going to come back to our more normal compact bone shape. Last couple of slides here are going to talk about the steps of fracture repair. Do not try to memorize this word for word. It's way more detailed than I'm going to require. If you can give me a sentence or two about bone repair, you're good to go. And this concludes Chapter 7, Part 2. I'll see you guys next video. Bye.